So again, this is the PACE and Pivot Learning webinar, Equity at the Local Level, Early COVID-19 Response in California School Districts. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Heather Huff. I'm the Executive Director of PACE. And we're really eager to talk with you about this topic today for a number of reasons. I think everybody in the state, everybody in the world knows the kinds of disruption that COVID-19 has brought into our schools and our classrooms. And we're all hungry for evidence about what types of things worked in the transition into the crisis initially. But everybody's minds now are on thinking about what happens in the months ahead. School is scheduled to start in August in many school districts. And so now superintendents, district and state leaders are thinking, what can we learn about what happened in the spring that can inform how we design our systems and our approaches in the fall to make sure that students get the kinds of supports they need to be safe, to be supported, and to thrive. And so that's the context in which we are sharing with you the results of two briefs that we produced on local district responses, and we are featuring the superintendents from those districts as well. So I'm going to give a brief overview of our panelists, and then we'll get into our agenda. So today we have Nadia Chinoy-Dabi, who's the Chief Growth Officer of Pivot Learning, Priyanka Kora and Hannah Melnico, who are also with Pivot Learning. And we will have Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, the superintendent in Pajaro Valley Unified School District, and Marcy Guthrie, who's the superintendent in Mother Lode Unified School District. And we'll spend the bulk of our time both kind of sharing the research from learning about these two districts, but then also having these two superintendents tell us in their own words how and why and what they did to respond to the emerging crisis and how they're thinking about their plans for moving forward. And then Ed Manansala, who's the superintendent in El Dorado County Office of Education, will provide some insights on these local practices and how we can think about how county and state structures can advance these practices at scale. So specifically, we'll talk about the two districts, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A in the speaker panel at the end. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started on that. The best way to communicate with the speakers is through the Q&A box. So you'll type your questions and comments into the Q&A box, and you can vote on other people's entries. This is a good way to make sure that the most popular questions get asked first. Slides and links to the resources can be found on PACE's event page, and this video recording plus the slides will be available online early next week for anybody that wasn't able to attend today. So without any further ado, I would like to hand this off to our first speaker, who will queue up both the results of the purpose of the project and some of the results of the research. So Priyanka Kora from Pivot Learning, Senior Research Associate. Thank you so much for having us today.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I am really excited to tell you all about our findings from Pajaro Valley USD. There we go. Before I jump in, just a little bit of framing. First, all of our research from talking with Pajaro Valley USD is from the first 3 weeks of their distance learning rollout. So these findings are really about the early decisions that were made. And then, as Heather said, we're lucky to have Dr. Rodriguez, the superintendent of the district, with us to explain more about later decisions and updates that came out of those first 3 weeks. So a little bit about Pajaro Valley. This district is located about an hour south of San Jose in Santa Cruz County. It's a rural district serving over 20,000 students. And we have some demographics here. What I really want you to focus on is that middle row, where you see that Pajaro Valley serves a really large percentage of English learners. About 42% of the district students are currently classified as English learners. And out of those, the majority speak Spanish as a first language, with about 2% speaking Mixteco Bajo, which is an indigenous Mexican language, as their first language. So I'm going to kind of whiz through the findings on the next few slides, again, just to make sure that you have time to hear from the superintendents a bit later. Here's a quote from an early interview with Dr. Rodriguez. As you can see, equity is really a priority in the district, and that can mean a lot of things. So I hope you'll find in the following findings what we mean by that and the ways that we saw equity come through in the early decision-making in this district. So first, early planning and mobilizing of existing resources facilitated a quick start to distance learning. We know that in California, different districts took a wide range of number of days and weeks to begin their distance learning program. In Pajaro Valley, it took 1 week to start distance learning between the day that the shelter-in-place order came out and the day that the students across the district were engaged in distance learning. So there's a few reasons that we saw for that led to this early and quick response. First was communication and planning started very early. So Dr. Rodriguez sent out her first communication about COVID in January of 2020, well before the shelter-in-place order. Second, the district already had enough Chromebooks for each student, so they weren't focused on acquiring Chromebooks. They did have to acquire some additional hotspots, but the real first decisions that had to be made were about distribution. So the district was able to quickly distribute hotspots and Chromebooks to students for use at home. And then they set an initial expectation of 5 hours of instructional time per day. I know Dr. Rodriguez might update us about some changes that have been made since then. Second, multilingual family outreach has been a long-term equity focus, and that is really important, especially in a district that has such a high percentage of English learners and families who speak other languages. I wanted to point even more specifically to the inclusive outreach that focused on not only the Spanish-speaking population, but also the Mixteco-Bajo speaking families, who represent about 2% of the district. Still, the district was able to prioritize them and find creative ways to reach out to this language minority. The district already had a high volume of outgoing communication, but doubled it in the first 3 weeks. They used lots of creative means of reaching families through the website, Facebook, and Twitter, and phone calls. One thing to note that the district explained to me is that Mixteco-Bajo doesn't have a written medium, so all communication in that language was done on phone and through videos. The district was able to use a lot of different resources, including their internal bilingual and multilingual staff, as well as using phone translation services such as Language Line to provide a lot of different types of information to their families early on. And thirdly, these community partnerships and distributed staff engagement are and were central to the district's COVID-19 response. So just to shout out a couple, one partnership with a community organization is with Salud para la Gente, which is a public health organization that created videos that the district was able to share in Mixteco-Bajo language. And then internal to the district, there is a migrant education department and parent engagement groups that are supported at the district level. These were really crucial as well for reaching families in their home language. And then third, early on, the district had set up a 2-tier system to help track student engagement in distance learning. So the first tier was at the district level. The tech department found data about which students had logged on or not, and then distributed it to schools for tier 2 communication, where teachers and administrators and counselors at the school level could use that data to follow up with families. So 2 kind of high-level lessons learned from this district. First, that navigating a widespread shift in instruction with an equity mindset at the beginning of the public health crisis better enabled this district to reach all students. And second, that facilitating communication in every home language is feasible with the help of community partners, and it's essential to keeping students and their families engaged in virtual learning. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Hannah Melnico, and I'm here to talk about Motherlode Union School District's response. Before I get into it, I'd like to give a little bit of framing about Motherlode Union. This is all based on interviews conducted with the district in April and May 2020, so their thinking absolutely has evolved on some of these areas. And Superintendent Guthrie is here with us today to add a little bit more context. You can see they're a district of about 1,000 students, grades K through 8, and their demographics that are featured here are pretty comparable to the state as a whole. When speaking with folks from the district, we heard a lot about their history of collaboration and how adults working well together really enabled them to meet this crisis. You can see that this was really an inflection point when the district was able to build on these relationships and work well together to support kids. Next, like many districts, Motherlode was grappling with making sure that their students had enough to eat and also just devices to connect to the internet to participate in online learning. You can see they reached a number of students through meal support and also Chromebook support. We also heard from the district that it was important to them to make sure it was clear that supports were available for all students who might be interested, so that anyone who might feel uncomfortable coming forward would feel more comfortable to do so. We also talked to them about what tech platforms they used and how they considered equity in relation to that decision. We heard from the district that they really wanted to establish, okay, what platform would be the most accessible for their students who are the most vulnerable, and that turned out to be Google Classroom due to different functionalities that it had. This allowed multiple educators to coordinate and meet students' needs. We also heard from the district that they were using Google Sheets and online intervention programs to track and document services received by students with disabilities to ensure that they were making progress towards their IEP goals. We were also interested in, okay, what are they tracking? How are they tracking it? How are they planning for 2020? We heard from the district that they are tracking which students were not logging on. For those students who are totally off the grid, the district would conduct welfare checks to make sure that everything was okay with the student and the family. Also, individual teachers were monitoring which students were participating, how engaged were they, and whether students were completing tasks. Looking ahead to fall 2020, when we were speaking with the district earlier this year, plans were still in development. They could include aspects of blended learning, and they also sent a survey to families in May 2020. So what can we learn from Motherlode Union's example? We saw that collaborative relationships between all of the adults in the system can really be leveraged during moments of crisis, that they can make transitions go more smoothly, and that these relationships can be built over time. And then finally, we saw that planning for equity is possible even in the midst of a crisis. Thank you all so much, and I will turn it over to Dr. Rodriguez at Pajaro Valley.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here. So you've already heard a little bit about Pajaro Valley Unified School District. So just to have a few additional points, I just want to point out the students that we serve. So 66% of them, at least at one time, were English learners. We do have 14% of our students that are special education and 10% that are migrant students. I want to just give credit and just a shout out to the almost 2,500 employees that we have at Pajaro Valley Unified School District, because they are the ones, along with our administration and our school board, that really made it happen. So a lot of times people ask me, so how is it that you all started so quickly? Think first and foremost, for many years now, since I've been in the school district, almost 4 years, we've really tried to align programs to our target for student success. and all staff is really focusing on nurturing the whole child. I always say that you have to have the base in order to be able to pivot and move quickly. So we always begin with the equity mindset, but we also couple that with an innovation framework. And so that's important because as what we were able to do is get started and then be willing to iterate and move as we go. But most importantly, really design those programs just as we are for restarting of school with our most vulnerable students in mind. So it's already been mentioned, this leverage of the ecosystems. I can't say how important that has been to us. So you'll see over 30 partners that are here on the screen. What we know to be true is that, especially in this atmosphere, the more people who are trying to connect and support students and families, the better. And so we have a wonderful ecosystem that on the daily supports our students, and we made sure and maintained the connection there with them. It was mentioned, we call it 360 communication, so full circle communication. It really is our equity focus. I'll just highlight 2 additional things that wasn't mentioned. I do weekly FAQs, so if you go to my superintendent website, there's a form there, but I have parents, community staff that every week provides me questions and I respond to them. So I think that is something that has been significantly strong for us, is the ability to have those iterative works. I also now am doing conversations with the superintendent around topics that are of concern. So this next time will actually be on our reopening plan. And we have, you heard about the strong group of parent leaders out there that are supported by our staff. So we have excellent parent educators that are teacher on special assignment and classified, that are all that they do, and their dedication is to engage parents. And so they really focused on looking at our website development, thinking about what does that parent experience look like and what do they need. And part of that is LCAP involvement, right? To ensure that the parents have a say in the way in which we are distributing and using and aligning our systems and our funding. And so then, as we look at communication is coupled with support, right? So something that we did from the very beginning is we set up hotline numbers. I'm going to show you the numbers of parents that were supported and teachers that were supported in a moment, but we set up a tech hotline because you cannot ask parents that are not technologically savvy or are having tech problems to solve their tech issues over technology, right? Of course, telephone is a form of technology, but so we had both phone support for both our parents and our teachers in Spanish, English, and Mixteco Bajo, and we also have drive-up approach. And so parents, it's really a wonderful thing to see. It happens right out here at the district office in the front on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where parents will literally drive up in their cars so they don't have to get out of their cars. Students are almost always there. They'll hand their Chromebook, they'll say what is wrong with it, and our text right then and there will fix what the problem is, or they will wind up replacing it if they need to. And so I think of anyone who has received the highest accolades in the school district, it has definitely been our tech department. So they are 100 and some strong. So they are a big force, whether it is our actual technicians that are working more on fixing and ensuring that everything is running smoothly, to our teachers on special assignment that are the coaches. They are all in every day and really focusing. And you can see that by the sheer numbers that they did. So talking about the drive-through that I just mentioned, they have almost serviced, and by now it probably is over 800. We have had 800 cars go through this district office at the roundabout to get those repairs. So it shows the importance of really providing that hands-on support to people. And then you can see the number of calls that they have supported in 3 languages, as well as supporting our teachers who have really done a phenomenal job. So we have been successful on having 100% of our students get a device. Connectivity is definitely on the rise, so we have distributed 1,000 hotspots by now. We received another 3,000, or we've received 1,000 additional. So we're going to receive an additional 3,000 by the end from the CDE Google partnership. And so we're really proud of that work. So when we talk about it, let's just be data driven, right? So we've done all this communication. We've had almost 100 communications come out from the school district within a 3-month period. And so that's a lot of communicating. So has it worked? Has it not worked? And so what I'm proud of is on this side is the teacher survey. On this side is the parent survey. We'll look at students in a minute. Interesting was the exact same percentage. You could see it's a little varied on strongly agree or agree, but both staff and teachers, staff, parents are 86% of them are saying that they received a consistent message about our response. I think that's important because that denotes whether people know where we should be going together. Right? And then when we look at knowing where to get help, 83% of the teachers said that they know where to go to get help. Talking just about parents and being able to access, 94% of them said that they could easily understand. Now, these are negative statements, so it's good that it's a low number. And so 11% said that the information was still too complex for them to understand. So what we try to do is really make things consumable for parents. And then when you talk about our students, 96% of our students say they can know how to get a hold of their teacher, right? That they're able to do that. And most importantly, right here at the last slide over here, 94% of the students said that they know how to use the technology, and probably the most important is 91% say that they know what they should be focusing on, right? So again, where are we putting our direction and our focus? So I was asked to talk about, so how do we know we're doing well along the way? And so we use SIPS, which is a form of instruction for foundational literacy, and you can see the elements in which it supports. So we have had a relationship, a partnership with CORE for many years now, where we have been working on training our teachers. Because the teachers know the importance of it, they have continued to provide SIPS instruction during distance learning. So you do see small group live instruction continuing to happen, and those opportunities to practice during during their distance learning time. And so then you say, okay, well, this input has happened. Well, how much has it supported? And so we have continued to do the mastery level tests, and you can see how we have students who are continuing to master new learning. This is important to me. So all this green here, this is important to me because a lot of people have taken on the stance that this is a time to enrich, or this is a time to reteach. It cannot be. We knew that we were going to be closed for 3 months, so it had to be a time that we continued to move forward. Apart from that, and it's in our daily instruction normally, is we wanted to continue to focus on our digital programs, because we know our digital programs, they personalize learning, and they also support students. And so you can see not only during distance learning time did it peak, and now it's gone down because we have closed school, but it also helped our students to get on grade level. So this is how they started, which means a lot of students were not on grade level, and then this is how they ended, with a large chunk of students that are performing above grade level. This is happening at the secondary level as well. We're using Power Up, and we're using Newzilla. I decided to show Newzilla here, again, showing how teachers were capitalizing on the strengths that we already had established within the school district. And so you can see the large increase there. You can see that kids were taking more quizzes, that students were looking at more articles. And then I just want to touch bases, and then I will end on our students with special needs. So one thing that we wanted to really make sure and do is to continue to support and track IEP goals. So what you'll see here is every single special education student has a matrix that was created for them. And so this is updated weekly. It's provided to parents and staff, and it really helps people to keep track of what we need to be focusing on for students. And this is a secondary version of that, linking to the lesson planning process. So we also want to make sure that we are communicating with parents. So this communication log is a service communication log that is done not only by our teachers, but by our instructional assistants and also our designated instructional support. And most importantly is then what we're doing, is it making a difference, right? And so here you can see the IEP progress goals, reports on goals. In this case for this child, of course, we blanked out who the child was, but you can see that in one case they made significant progress, or in two cases they made significant progress. And then in one, the child did not make progress, right? Because it was transitioned to employment. And so that was something that we weren't able to do for them. And so for our non-participators, it was mentioned, and this is how we outreach. So the first tier was teachers, then it went to counselors, and then our third tier is actually student services, interactive dialogue. And you can see that we did have quite a few less non-participators at the elementary level than at the secondary, but it's something that is important. And because I have now, these are two examples. If you go back to the PowerPoint, you'll be able to see these are two highlights of just the intense work that our parent education specialists are doing to support students. So it's not one contact, but it's multiple contacts as they're going. And I will leave this so that others can speak, but this is just talking about our contingency work that we're doing. We have a group of 50 different staff members from both our teacher and classified unions we build our work off of our guiding principles. So that way we are able to use that as a litmus test to always keep students at the center. And this is our timeline. So we're working hard to get it out to partners starting next week and moving it forward. Again, always supporting English learners and creating structures for them to support them. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Rodriguez, for sharing your journey with us thus far. I'd like to turn it over now to Superintendent Marcy Guthrie in Mother Lode Union School District to share with us her experiences in her district. Superintendent Guthrie?
Well, thank you. I don't know if you can see me.
We can.
Perfect. So first of all, wow, Pajaro Valley, very impressed, Dr. Rodriguez. Mother Lode Union School District took a different approach for lots of reasons. We have 1,000 students. And we actually did pivot quite early as well. March 13th, 2020 will be a date in my mind forever that that will live with me. It was also my mother's birthday when I had to have emergency staff meetings to tell our staff that we might be closing. Well, that we were closing, excuse me, but we were thinking at the time only for 1 week. And it ended up being for the rest of the school year. So what I want to say is that from the boardroom to the classroom to all of the support staff, it did take a team to make us survive and thrive during school closures, because everyone did step up. We had just had 2 new leaders for the CTA union and the CSEA union, and we had invited them to the California Labor Management Initiative conference in Sacramento that was jointly put on by SCOE and EDCO, El Dorado County Office of Education. And we came away with a framework on how we could work together. And I have been reminded time and time again, had they not said yes, had we not taken this opportunity, it may have been a more difficult challenge moving through very difficult times. But instead, we worked together with a shared framework and mission to support our students through this process. One of the things that I think I cannot underscore enough is how our leaders and our teachers and our support staff work together. Our principals are gurus, and we understood and knew our teaching staff, and many of them were not necessarily tech savvy and hadn't really even thought about what distance learning might look like. So our board approved a distance learning plan, and we took 2 weeks to get ourselves up to speed. We had teachers who were leaders in the area of Google Classroom, but we also had teachers who had never heard of Google Classroom. So we had to rally and support one another. So our principals actually became the instructional leaders, created Google Classrooms and put all of their teachers inside their Google Classroom and modeled for them how to use the tools for distance learning. And then our bright spots are teachers who really were leaders with using Google Classroom and other online tools, helped the other staff members in their grade levels along on the journey. And so from the feedback we received from our teachers, they really appreciated the leadership and instruction from their principals, but they also appreciated the collaboration and co-learning with their colleagues. I would also say that the same is true for Dr. Sadie Hedegaard, our Director of Student Support Services. One of many things that she does is she oversees special education. So she took the same approach with our special educators and our paraprofessionals and coached them up on how to use Google Classroom, how to use Zoom, how to use the instructional materials that we used on the daily for one-on-one or small group instruction for our students, whether they were English learners or students with disabilities. So we were able to continue our interventions, thanks to also Carrie Heilman, our Title I teacher, and our general education instructional aides. So we were using Read Live. We also use Sunday for our neediest readers in our special education programs. So those programs and that work continued through distance learning. I would say that we were dogged about making sure we've connected with all of our families. Now remember, we're just over 1,000 students, and that's about 875 unique families. And at the end of it all, after some El Dorado County Sheriff wellness checks and home visits, we were able to track down all but about 15 to 17. I think those were our last numbers. Some people I want to thank are chief business official. You know, when you're in a small school district, you wear many hats. So I wear personnel, our chief business official does budget, but she does facilities, maintenance, operations. She was totally working behind the scenes to make sure that we were checking out the 770 Chromebooks and we could track those. Because, you know, CBOs like to make sure that we manage our assets well. That's a shout out to Lisa Donaldson. She also was responsible for the maintenance and operations side of things. So her challenge was also to make sure that things were clean, that we could access our facilities, that she collaborated with our union leaders to make sure that we could schedule our classified staff on a rotating basis so that we could honor everyone's need to socially distance while also conduct the essential work of the district. Our transportation department drove the nutrition services van out to our most needy bus stops on a daily basis to deliver breakfast and lunch. And actually, we just really, when you're small and you're rural, it's about relationships and staying connected. So our teachers did a really nice job of making sure that if they weren't connecting with students and families, that they were letting their principals know. And we were using our bilingual instructional aides, our bilingual school clerks and our bilingual principal to help us reach out to those families. I would say, as I'm watching my time, we learned a lot. Feedback from our surveys from our parents, our students, our teachers, and our support staff would say it was nothing short of a miracle that we thrived during this time. But we also learned that if we looked in the rearview mirror, we could have benefited from greater and clearer expectations for students, for parents, and for teachers. That's no one's fault except for we in hindsight would say it sure would have been nice to have clearer expectations for everyone involved. Parent education on how to use online tools is something that we know we need to work on. I would say our English only teachers and support staff conveyed that they struggled during distance learning to connect with our Spanish speaking parents. And so we have some planned changes for the next school year. I think it was really important for us, and I think Dr. Rodriguez said the same thing, to keep as much normal as we possibly could. So if we were using certain instructional programs or virtual online programs to maintain that for continuity. And during this time, we were bombarded with everyone was giving us everything free under the sun. And we tried to kind of keep the focus. I would like to say that as we look ahead to the 2020, we've had our district learning team, and that's our labor management initiative team, huddle and problem solve and draft a 100% everyone returns with some restrictions and structures in place, a total distance learning plan, and a blended learning plan. And our board supports our work. We anticipate a very strong need for a mathematics focus, but we are taking the approach that instead of thinking remediation as we start the new year, we're looking at the new teacher project's recent April 2020 publication about learning acceleration guide. So thinking differently about how we're planning and delivering instruction, because we know that our students may have had a loss of an opportunity to meet their grade level expectations. And so instead of thinking, how are we going to remediate? We might need to be thinking about how are we going to prioritize and accelerate as we come back to school in August. So with that, I would just like to thank you all for having me. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation and learn alongside you.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Guthrie. And we're going to turn it over to Superintendent Ed Manansala of the El Dorado County Office of Education, also the past president of the California County Superintendents Association. Ed, I would love for you to talk for our audience a bit about how to reflect on some of these promising local practices. We've just heard two superintendents talk about the very rich and powerful work that they're doing locally, but as a state with 1,000+ districts, how can we think about scaling some of those practices? And how can we think about, how should we be thinking about the challenges yet to come in the fall?
Thank you. So I just want to confirm, can you hear me okay, Heather?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that the work of Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Guthrie, it's clear that what I've observed, leaders who have a clarity of vision, and this is pre-COVID, of just key elements of instruction and learning and equity, appeared to have a different level of anchoring, if you will, in navigating such great challenges. So I had referenced in a prior PACE panel back in December that was focused on continuous improvement, that even the district superintendents in El Dorado County were acknowledging that since the inception of LCFF to present, again at that time in December, there was just so much going on, and there was a fundamental recommitment to relentlessly focus on teaching and learning. And as some of you may recall, that in various counties, in many rural counties, where you were even dealing with public safety power shutoffs. So again, clarity of vision of key elements of instruction, learning, and equity seem to be a key anchor as we move through various stages. If I was to highlight a few things, and then I know we need to shift to questions and answers for the panel. I've been looking at this work, and I'm referring to the work around the COVID onset in 5 phases, in a sense looking at past, present, and future. And pre-COVID would be phase 1. The second phase would be the onset of COVID to school closure. Phase 3 would be looking at distance learning, which we've been emphasizing now. And then re-entry for phase 4, and just a sense of reimagination and transformation for schools in phase 5. And what I've observed with the partnerships with county offices and districts is that the collaborative structures become very critical during this time. So for example, in El Dorado County, 12 of our districts, 12 of the 15 districts, are TK8 districts, and they feed into one high school district. So the structures of learning in terms of best practices in respect to distance learning, or what we're about to enter in respect to re-entry, capitalizing on those structures become important. So for example, in Shasta County, I'm aware they've created essentially PLCs, professional learning communities, in a virtual environment, because we knew that as teachers were shifting to distance learning, there were going to be great challenges given that many were uncomfortable in that shift. Looking at this idea of distance learning, I think as Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Guthrie were speaking to basic needs issues like meals and technology, I believe county offices have been coming alongside to try to identify where those gaps are. And there's been some creative approaches in trying to ensure that students and families have access to not only the devices that they need, but the technology. So for example, I know in our county, we have outfitted vans, and in other counties where they've outfitted buses within districts and even county offices to ensure that on those buses there would be Wi-Fi access for specific communities. I think the last thing that I would just like to highlight, and there, again, I really want to be able to open it up to the question format. What I've been saying is that in areas, in this case, take re-entry, for example, where there are counties or districts that are doing good work, we've been watching how we maximize our county, regional, and statewide structures, even like this platform, to be able to share best practices more rapidly. So it really, again, is taking advantage of the structures that are in place. Let me close with one last thought. Dr. Jim Tarwater is someone who I referenced back in December, referencing as the superintendent of South Lake Tahoe. And he announced his retirement in January. never did he imagine that in his final few months that he would be finishing school in a pandemic. But again, this is a leader who's deeply committed to equity, deeply committed to truly ensuring that his teachers and students and families receive the right support, right down to the point where he said, really would like to be able to come up with a creative approach, even with all of the challenges in respect to graduation, and fought for not only a drive-by graduation, but one, if you're familiar with South Lake Tahoe, where parents would be able to drive their students to the bottom of a ski lift. And next week, his students will actually be receiving their diploma at the top of a mountain overlooking the Sierras. Again, I'm giving you that visual. What I'm finding again is Dr. Tarwater was one, his clarity of vision around instruction, but really was trying to navigate such great challenges. So I'll leave it at that because I know there are many questions to field.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Manansala. And I'd like to invite all of the panelists to unmute and come back on video. And I'd like to invite the participants to put in any questions into the Q&A box. The first set of questions that I have is for our district superintendent, Superintendent Rodriguez and Superintendent Guthrie. All of the coverage in the news and indications coming from the Department of Education is that distance learning is something we should expect to be doing, whether it's full-time or part-time hybrid schedules in the fall. How are you thinking about contingency planning to get to those kids that were not participating and do not participate? What are some of the interventions that you're considering for bringing those kids back in?
Marcy, would you like to go first, or would you like me to?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so I know I went very quickly over the non-participator slide. So first and foremost, who we know has the most connection with parents and students is their teacher. So what we placed in the distance learning expectations for our teachers and our teachers were able to do is the majority were able to do it through their own personal outreach. So I do want to note that. That is also our wraparound services. So we have a significant group of about 300 instructional assistants and behavior techs. They also were part of that tier 1 support. If we couldn't get a hold of them then we went to the counselors. And so the counselors and administrators, they were the second rung of support. If not, then we actually went to the third rung, which is our student services department, and they went through an interactive dialogue process. The thing that we found that was most important is to identify the barrier to non-participation and then eliminate it. So in some cases, we have some very rural areas that hotspots don't work and they don't have internet. So we went to a program where they were able to have the paper version instead of the computer version. Or in some cases, they were a 13, 14-year-old having to take care of their 5, 6-year-old brothers and sisters. And so we did what was called reduction to the core, where we reduced down to their core subjects. So for us, I think it's looking strategically at the system and saying, what are the barriers to success? I think the one barrier that we're still working on, especially for our middle school students, is motivation. So we know that they can log on because 96% of our students were logging on to Google Classroom daily. The question was how can we actually support it to where they're submitting work and willing to sustain learning in an environment where they don't have as much feedback to stay on task.
I would say all of that on a smaller scale for Mother Lode Union School District. Our counselors, our school psychologists, our teachers are the main line to our families. Although feedback from my teachers would say, it was a little overwhelming if you wanted me to hunt down the students and plan for instruction and be sensitive to social emotional learning. For them, that was like a lot to ask. So that's a reflection for us that we're gonna adjust. But I would say that the one thing that kept my elementary teachers up at night, TKK1, was that they knew their students and they knew their needs. And so they, through this process, had a blend of Google Classroom. They used Blooms. They did paper pencil. They did Zoom for some social things and some story times and some whatnot. But research that's recently coming out from NWEA is, in addition to our English learners, our foster youth, and our students with disabilities as being, there being a concern for a widening of the achievement gap. The most troublesome or worrisome group that we need to think about now are our TK through 2 students, because they don't have the literacy or the tech skills yet to really establish that strong foundation. And I just am so thankful that this happened in March and not in October, because we all know in TKK, the light bulb turns on, and in first grade, they have to learn so much when it comes to literacy that it could have been more devastating than it actually is at this time. So thank you for your wise responses to that question, but we really do have some concerns about what is this going to look like for our TKK1 students moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up on that, we have a number of questions that are asking for some flesh on the bones of instruction. Good instruction around literacy, accelerating student need, especially for students that are academically behind or already were, or for students learning English, for students with disabilities. Those things are hard to do in a normal setting. How are you thinking about training teachers and supporting teachers to do this in a virtual setting?
So I mentioned a little bit what we're doing on foundational literacy, because I completely agree with Marcy that in order to do foundational literacy well, there has to be some type of perceived in-person support, right? So what we did is we continued to do our SIPS groups, which are mastery level groups, our SIPS groups. We continued to do those lessons with children. We continued to do the mastery tests to ensure that they were in fact learning what we thought they were learning. And we wanted that to continue to happen. I do believe, I am a believer that digital programs work for very young children as well. We also have a program called Footsteps to Brilliance that students are using as little as 18 months old. And it's in English and Spanish, and it's available to every single community member within the school district boundaries for free. So I do believe in a blended approach, of course. So you're not going to have a five-year-old that's on the computer the entire time, but I do believe that that students can and do learn from blended programs as well, as long as there is that teacher component to move forward.
I'm trying to remember the question.
Well, let me pose a different question to you, since we have a lot. There's been a growing awareness of the impact of the pandemic, also of racial awareness, and a lot of the unrest, the economic impact. All of these things combined are taking their toll on the mental health of students and the families. How are you thinking about how your district will address mental health issues?
May I go first?
Yes, please.
So Motherlode was committed to social emotional learning already. So we've adopted a program. We built a schedule at our middle school that it was taught every day. We called it the Connections class. I would say that anticipating what re-entry is going to look like in the fall, our school psychologist has taken it upon himself. And now remember scale here. I have one school psychologist and one school counselor because I have 2 schools. But our school counselor has taken it upon himself to actually really create the first 2 weeks of lessons for social emotional learning that would be developmentally appropriate TK through grade 8, to kind of in anticipation of COVID-19, school closures, and also national unrest. And so I'm just grateful that we have like depth on the team, that they'll say, I see a need, I have a niche or a talent, and I can step up and do this for the district. And I think that doesn't mean that it's a be all end all, but we are indeed anticipating, and we are putting our professionals who have the skills in their back pocket to the task of really helping us transition.
Thank you. Superintendent Rodriguez, anything to add on that?
So kind of going along those lines, what we've talked about, especially in the contingency planning, is how do we build relationships in a virtual online setting, right? So how do we really build those connections? So again, like we said, it happened in March, and so we already had a lot of that relationship built. So how do you ensure that you are building relationships with your 7th grader when you have never physically seen them? I mean, luckily we have the technology where we can see each other through Google Meet and such, but it's different, right? The personal physical contact is enriches a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Go ahead, Superintendent Guthrie.
Well, I was thinking about, you know, these are tough budget times as well. And so staffing became an issue, and what is it going to look like, right? So when the guidance came out from CDE, and one of the recommendations was this looping idea, right? You know, kind of making sure that there are relationships in place. And so we're having conversations with our staff about perhaps, not that they all want to loop, but where we have combination classrooms, because we will probably have a few combination classrooms, having a large group of students who would already been with that teacher may help actually also build that, maintain those relationships, deepen those relationships, and ease the transition. So I just thought that makes a lot of sense. I think it was Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond who would kind of initially put that out there, and it ended up landing in the guidance. And so those are the kind of conversations we're having in Motherload about how that can also help.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, with just 3 minutes left, I would like to ask Hannah Melnico to wrap us up with providing some of the high-level recommendations or findings for what LEAs can do. But just before that, I'd like to thank our superintendents in El Dorado County, in Motherload, and in Pajaro Valley. The big challenge here we have as a state is that every place is needing to create the approaches that work best for their students. And so there is an important role for state level guidance, and that's something we're watching play out right now in Sacramento and across the state. But part of what we wanted to do with both these briefs and this webinar is just to highlight in a very rich way the kinds of considerations and tools and developments that are being done at the local level so that folks can get some of those ideas and spark some of their own practice. So Hannah, would you wrap us up with providing for our audience what some of those key takeaways were from these 2 case studies of what districts can and should do?
Absolutely, and I'll also send these along via chat because it's a little wordy. Here's what we recommend. Number 1, districts should begin with an equity mindset, and that's possible even in the midst of a crisis, as we saw in these 2 districts. We saw that district administrators should facilitate communication in every home language that their students speak. We saw that collaborative relationships between the adults in the system can facilitate these transitions during times of crisis, and that these relationships can be built. And then finally, stable funding from the federal government and the state in the year ahead will be critical.
Thank you so much for that. And I'd like to recommend, there were a lot of questions that came up about some details, and there's a lot more detail in the briefs that we wrote. These 2 superintendents were very deeply involved with the staff at Pivot to collect that data and to write it up. So highly encourage everybody to go review those 2 briefs. And thank you again for joining us today. Really appreciate all of you.